CNBC-TV18.
Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. World leaders have gathered in Japan's Hiroshima for the G7 summit, which kicks off today. The Russia-Ukraine war, US-China tensions and international trade will take center stage at the G7 high table. The day began on a somber note as Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, US President Joe Biden and other G7 leaders laid wreaths to honor the victims of US atomic bombing in 1945. The G7 have once again called on Russia to end the war in Ukraine. They have agreed on imposing new sanctions on Moscow to starve them of technology, industrial equipment and services that fuels Russia's war machinery. While Ukraine President Zelensky is set to attend the summit in person, as for the Quad Leaders Summit, it will now be taking place in Hiroshima instead of Australia. And the next one will be held in India. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi also arrived in Hiroshima. India is among the invitees to the summit. In an interview to Japanese news portal Nikkei, the Prime Minister said he wanted to amplify the voices and concerns of the Global South. I spoke with Patsy Widakuswara, White House Bureau Chief for Voice of America earlier today, and I began by asking her about the agenda and broad focus of the G7 meeting.
So the broad focus of the G7 here in Hiroshima, Japan, has really been the two countries that are not part of the G7, that is China and Russia. So the 7 wealthy democracies that are convening here in Hiroshima are essentially looking at two things. Number one, how to push back against Russian aggression in Ukraine, how to support Ukraine in terms of applying more sanctions on Russia, creating a situation where there are less likelihood of evasions of those sanctions. And number two, how to make China follow the rules of the road in terms of international trade, combating what this group calls China's economic coercion practices. So those two major themes are really just the thing that overshadows everything, even though the host, the Japanese government of Prime Minister Kishida, has already also reached out to the Global South. That's why he is inviting countries that are not members of the G7, including India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Comoros, and so on, be part of this discussion, in part to link together the agenda of the G7 towards the upcoming agenda of the G20, which of course will be hosted by India. So those two big themes, as well as including the Global South, is the dominant theme of this G7 here at the Hiroshima in Japan.
Patsy, when it comes to sanctions, what have we seen so far with countries stepping up sanctions against Russia?
Yeah, so the G7 countries came out with a pretty strong statement on Ukraine. You know, this is on the first day of the summit. They came out saying that we support all efforts to defend Ukraine to reach what they called a just and long-lasting peace, which means that Russia has to withdraw all its troops from occupied territories. And so the leaders also came out with their own packages of sanctions. The U.S. came out with something like, sanctions, fresh new sanctions on at least 300 entities. The UK came out with sanctions on diamonds, on copper, on aluminum, and other industries. So the focus really is on the enforcement of existing sanctions, as well as broadening those sanctions to new sectors and new industries. And as far as support for Ukraine, of course, the big news coming out of this G7 is President Zelensky of Ukraine, who made the visit to Hiroshima in order to rally support for his country. This is, again, something that the G7 leaders have been really strong in terms of supporting, as well as the invitees that are non-G7 countries. So in terms of Russia, there's a clear message coming out of the G7 countries that they reject the kind of behavior that has come out of Russia. They reject the kind of a nuclear threat that Russia has been using in terms of deploying tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus, for example. So these are all very, very strong statements coming out of the leaders.
Patsy Widakuswara, thank you so much for joining us here on Global Eye. To take this forward, we're now joined by Erin Murphy, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow for Economics at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Erin, thank you so much for joining us. Give us a sense of the economic priorities of President Joe Biden as he meets leaders at the G7 meeting in Hiroshima.
There are several priorities that Joe Biden, I think, will pursue at the G7 summit. The one, and it's been mentioned earlier in the show, is how to decouple from China, or at least diversify supply chains in other sectors, especially when it comes to critical minerals, semiconductors, and how the G7 partners can work together to either friendshore, find ways to support each industry in their countries to help diversify that supply chain, whether it's in critical minerals, especially when you're looking at electric vehicles or semiconductor chips. Another one is, how do you support the global South? Having India there, Vietnam, Indonesia, I think is an important indicator that the US, but also G7 partners are looking to support the global South to be strategically competitive with China, offering an alternative to the Belt and Road and other areas in infrastructure and development. 2 years ago, the G7 partners announced a major infrastructure initiative, and last year they named it the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, which was looking to produce a $600 billion fund to support high-quality, standards-filled infrastructure throughout the global South in Latin America, Africa, and in the Indo-Pacific. But $600 billion is not going to be enough to address the trillions of dollars of the infrastructure gap, but it's a start.
Right. Erin, the United States clearly wants to poke China's economic coercion on the table, fair and square, at the G7. How much support does the United States really have? And are the policies which the US is using till now to counter China economically, are they really succeeding on the ground?
Well, I think that's a great question, because this is certainly easier said than done. I think one thing to note is the change in tone on Chinese economic coercion, but also how to work with China. You can't destroy the world's second largest economy. That's a billion person economy. You don't want to hurt the actual Chinese people themselves. So you've seen a bit of a step back in the rhetoric, where Secretary Yellen, even a few weeks ago in her speech, had said, we don't look to destroy the economy or hurt the Chinese people. And I think that message has been reiterated in the G7. That said, conversely, what the G7 partners are saying is that they're not willing to tolerate Chinese economic coercion against smaller countries. We've seen them do this to Australia, Lithuania, and the Philippines, and looking forward to seeing where China has a stronghold in a lot of critical industries, especially when it comes to semiconductors, solar supply chain. I think that the G7 is looking for a way to do this. A lot of words, a lot of speeches, a lot of announcements have been said, but whether or not this will come to pass, I think is another question. Again, it's easier to say this than do this, and I think that
Right.
as the G7 countries look to unwind or decouple or find alternative ways to produce, say, semiconductors, they're going to figure out how intertwined they are with China, but also that you can't create a domestic industry from scratch. For example, a semiconductor fabrication facility costs
Right.
about $20 billion to make. Is that really worth the investment? In terms of whether or not the U.S. has support among the G7 countries, I think it varies in level of support. I think that the U.S. can rely on India and Japan in terms of its considerations of China and how they view economic coercion is definitely a national security concern for all three of those countries.
Okay.
For the Europeans, it's been a bit more of a mixed bag. We've seen Macron, the French leader, sort of warm up a little bit more to China. And then there's been questions over how strong Germany's support is for the United States' efforts to combat China. So I think, it will remain to be seen, especially as they start pursuing these policies of diversifying away from China and seeing how difficult that could be.
Okay, just to ask you on the Quad summit, which was supposed to take place in Australia, had been cancelled earlier. And in fact, the Prime Minister of Australia went on record to do so because President Biden was not coming. Now, the leaders have decided to do it in Hiroshima itself. What kind of a message does this send out regarding the urgency connected with this meeting?
I think rescheduling the Quad and having them meet in Hiroshima is a strong signal that the leaders are committed to this cooperation, to this collaboration. In the last 2 years, the Quad has certainly stepped up in its engagement. What was once an informal partnership to address critical issues, whether it's relief efforts after the 2004 Boxing Day tsunami, now you're seeing kind of a proliferation of in areas where they are cooperating, whether it's healthcare, especially with COVID-19 support, semiconductors, critical technologies, education, maritime security awareness, space. I mean, it's really proliferated in terms of interest. So I think having the leaders meet, there's not going to be a lot of substance in a leaders meeting, but what it does show is strong optics that this partnership will continue, that it is strong, that it is a priority for all four leaders of the Quad countries.
Right. Do you expect the G7 leaders in their bilateral meetings with Prime Minister Modi to put pressure to decouple from Russia? India has maintained an independent relationship with Russia. We have always maintained that war should come to an end. We have to give diplomacy a chance. Negotiations must bring the war to an end. But at the same time, we continue buying oil from Russia. Our trade relationship continues. Our independent relationship with Russia continues on its own. Do you get a sense there will be pressure in India to decouple?
I certainly think so. I mean, the Russia-Ukraine war has been a significant topic for the G7. In fact, one of the top topics of the G7 discussion, the announcement of sanctions, increased pressure on Russia to stop its attacks on Ukraine. And I think certainly Prime Minister Modi will feel the pressure from the G7 to take some action in curbing its economic relationship with Russia. I mean, understanding that India has its own policies, it's been helpful on China, and I think that that's been welcome. But on Russia, I think it's been a bit of a disappointment. So I do expect that Prime Minister Modi will get some strong pressure from all of the members of the G7 to do something on Russia.
All right, Erin Murphy, it was a pleasure having you here on Global Eye, talking about President Biden's priorities at the G7 and what the G7 would like to convey to India as well on the Ukraine war. Thanks once again for being with us here on CNBC TV18. Moving on to the free trade agreement talks between India and the United Kingdom, which are set to resume next month. Reports say the nations are still struggling to make progress due to differences on some key tariff and investment protection rules. The governments are not able to find a middle ground on the duties levied by India on car and liquor imports. And besides tariffs, the UK government is also pushing India to agree on a strong investment protection treaty. To take this forward, we're now joined by Manoj Ladwa, founder and CEO, India-Inc Group, also the founder of India Global Forum. Manoj Ladwa, thank you so much for being with us here on CNBC TV18. What's your current view on India-UK relations? There's likely to be a meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Rishi Sunak at the G7 in Hiroshima. What do you think the two leaders would like to convey to each other and the current state of play between the two nations?
Thank you, Parikshit. It's good to be on your show. I think that the relationship hasn't been stronger than it is now. There are a myriad of areas of cooperation, both on the economic and on the strategic aspects as well of the relationship. Recently, the two countries have signed an agreement on science and technology. And so it's a busy, active, deep and historic relationship that is growing day by day. And so I think that the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Sunak is going to be a continuation of the conversations they've been having over the last few months. This will be the third time that they formally speak. And it will certainly, the free trade agreement will be high on the agenda, as will be areas of cooperation and deeper cooperation on security. But there's a lot to discuss in the UK-India relationship, and so it'll be a busy meeting.
Right. Recently, of course, because of the protests, the pro-Khalistan protests that had taken place outside the Indian High Commission in UK, it did seem that the talks on the trade agreement would slow down as a result. But then there were statements from the top political levels in both countries reiterating the commitment to the free trade deal. where do things stand, and what are some of the sticking points which are slowing down the negotiation in the FTA, according to you?
Well, I think the fact that both the leaderships have made it very clear that the concerns around pro-Khalistani extremism here in the UK, or indeed anywhere in the world, is a matter of deep concern, not only for India, but also for the United Kingdom. But the fact that both leaders have said that the two issues of trade negotiations and dealing with extremism should not be conflated, should be decoupled. And I think that's a very good sign of the maturity of the relationship and the willingness of the leadership, as you say, on both sides to move things forward. As far as the trade talks are concerned, I believe that there's a very positive round that just concluded a few days ago, and the next set of talks are due to start around the 5th of June. And you'd always expect there to be some wrangling as you approach the finishing line, and there will be areas, and some of which you have identified, where there are areas of divergence. But ultimately, I think a free trade agreement between the two nations is a win-win, or will be a win-win for both countries. And it'll be good if we can conclude that as soon as possible.
When it comes to tariffs on Scotch whisky and automobiles, will this be a difficult hurdle to cross, or do you feel that issues around standards, issues around the investment protection agreement that the UK is demanding, those are some of the critical issues on the table as well from the UK side?
Look, the issue of whiskey and car tariffs and so on has been something that's been on the table for some time. The UK has made its position clear on these areas, but I think the information that I have is that both sides are working extremely hard to come to some sort of understanding on those issues. As far as investment protection is concerned, India's position has been, well noted in the UK that there are existing protocols and laws that do protect investments, and so it is a niggly issue for sure. But again, something that I don't think is unsurmountable when there is willingness on both sides, which has been clearly indicated. So I look at all these issues in the normal flow of negotiations, and there is willingness on both sides to conclude as quickly as possible. So I'm quite optimistic that these will be ironed out, and no doubt some of these points will be flagged during the conversation between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Sunak when they meet in Japan.
Manoj Ladwa, how strongly is the Indian diaspora pushing for a strong FTA and an early conclusion of the FTA between India and UK?
Well, the biggest flag bearers of the UK-India relationship is the 1.6 million strong diaspora. Prime Minister Modi has described the diaspora as the living bridge between the UK and India. And so there is a considerable amount of eagerness that not only whilst cultural ties and people-to-people ties are very strong, strategic ties should improve and deepen further, and economic ties in particular should improve and strengthen further. And an FTA between the two countries would be a great indicator of the determination to really make sure that the relationship is future-proofed and stands the test of time as we go through troubled waters, and as we look at ways in which both countries can help each other to bolster economic growth between themselves.
My final question, India currently is at the G7. The Prime Minister is there. He will be holding bilateral meetings with world leaders, including the President of Ukraine, President Zelensky. A lot of expectations from India to solve debt issues around the world, have some consensus on cryptocurrency regulations, have some agreement on resilient supply chains, do more in terms of bringing the war in Ukraine to an end. How should India use this presidency to set the global agenda, according to you, Manoj?
I think Prime Minister Modi has already set the agenda and continues to set the agenda. Specifically on Ukraine, India's position has been crystal clear, and his Prime Minister Modi's comment that this is not an era for war is something that has resonated across the world and taken very seriously. He is seen as the senior-most and the most experienced leader of head of government in the democratic world, and therefore naturally world leaders will be looking to him for direction, for guidance, and I'm sure that he will continue to provide that and lean upon the experience that he's gathered over the 9 years as Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy. Also, I think you will see more conversation around the Global South and how the post-pandemic revival has to be much, much more inclusive. Institutions and global institutions need reform, need to accentuate their focus more and more on the Global South so that we can truly see a global recovery post the huge shock that the world suffered under the pandemic.
Manoj, we've completely run out of time, but thank you so much for joining us here on Global Eye, giving us your view of India-UK relations and the role India should play with its presidency of the G20. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. Thank you for watching. Goodbye, but don't go anywhere as well. Lots coming up on CNBC-TV18.
Friends.